Hello, my name is Loretta Ryan. I'm the Director of Public Affairs for the Ontario Professional Planners Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar on second units in Ontario. Before we get things underway, I just want to go over a few technical items. We'd like to ask everyone who's listening, if you've not already done so, please let us know in the chat box which municipality or firm you're from and how many people are sitting in on the session. It'll give us a good idea who's on the call. Thank you. We will be answering questions following the presentation, so save your questions. You can key these in using the chat box, which will open up at the end of the webinar. Also, you can send an email to Arlene. Her account is aetchen@cmhc.ca. That's aetchen@cmhc.ca. Please note we're recording this webinar, and it will soon be posted on OPPI's YouTube channel, along with other planning-related videos. For those of you who have dialed in by phone and are unable to access the video portion of the webinar, we apologize. We only had a limited number of lines, but please stay on and listen, and we're going to make the video available next week. In 2011, the Province of Ontario amended the Planning Act to improve the supply of affordable housing in Ontario by requiring municipalities to allow second suites in detached, semi-detached, row houses, and ancillary structures. Today, we are going to talk about where implementation is at, the barriers, and the solutions. Without further delay, I'd like to turn the microphone over to our speakers. I'm pleased to introduce Victor Doyle, who's one of the managers in the Provincial Planning Policy Branch of the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and Arlene Etchen. She's the Knowledge Transfer Consultant at CMHC.
Thank you, Loretta. Good afternoon, everybody. Victor Doyle here. So I'm going to walk you through a few slides, and then we're going to just trying to get the slide going. We're going to turn things over to Arlene in a minute, and then I'll be back a little later on. So first of all, we thought we'd just remind people what second units are. So they're self-contained residential units with a private kitchen and bathroom facilities and sleeping areas within a dwelling, single, detached, semi-detached, or row dwelling, or within structures ancillary to a dwelling, like a laneway garage. We often think of second units as being basement apartments, but there are certainly other kinds. You sometimes see them on the second floor or the third floor of a house. Sometimes an addition is built to a house which will function as a second unit. Sometimes you'll see them in an ancillary structure like a laneway garage. So they come in a number of places within a house or on a property. So one of the reasons the government has been promoting second units, and we'll get into that more, is because of the numerous benefits that they can result in. So certainly they can allow homeowners to earn additional income, particularly perhaps young homeowners or even elderly ones who are looking to help pay the mortgage. Particularly in this time of increasing challenges with affordability, an attractive situation for some people. They can also help to address the changing demographics. Particularly as we have an aging population, and again, this could assist, apart from the income stream, helping elderly people stay in their homes longer. They also, because there's such an affordable form of rental housing, can allow for a more mixed income communities, which are more inclusive and integrated. And clearly they can help make more efficient use of existing infrastructure, and including transit. And on a similar note, they can certainly help make better use of the existing housing stock. And just on those last 2 points, our average household size has declined from somewhere over 5 people per household to about 2.5. So in many communities, some of this existing stock and infrastructure was designed for larger households, and so second units are a good way to help make more efficient use of both. And then lastly, they certainly can help create jobs in the construction and renovation industry. So a multitude of benefits. And one of the purposes of this webinar is to share some of the existing legislation, the current situation, some recent events, and to share some resources with you so that as planners and other professionals and housing representatives, you can help promote second units and raise awareness of them to your councils and public. So as Loretta mentioned, the Planning Act was amended in 2011 as part of the Ontario government's long-term affordable housing strategy in 2010. And it was to facilitate affordable housing. It was the first long-term strategy for Ontario on the housing front. And specifically, as part of that, the Planning Act, Section 16, was amended to require municipalities to amend their official plans, and in another section 34 and their zoning bylaws to authorize second units in single detached, semi-detached, and row dwellings, and in ancillary structures such as laneway garages if a second unit was not present in the primary structure. So it's an either or situation in terms of what the Planning Act requires. In addition, the Planning Act was amended to allow the minister to make regulations in relation to second units, and I'm going to come back to that later in the webinar as we posted a proposed regulation on second units as of yesterday, and that's on the environmental registry. So fast forward to 2016, and there was an update of the long-term affordable housing strategy, and it included some continued emphasis on second units, and in particular, promoting second units in the construction or design of new homes. And to support that renewed emphasis, the Development Charges Act was amended to allow for a regulation which would exempt second units from development charges, just as they are currently for second units being constructed in existing homes. So the treatment for development charges would be the same, and they would be exempted in both new homes and existing homes. That regulation has not been posted yet, but we can look forward to seeing it in the near future. In addition, our buildings department or branch was instructed to look at potential amendments to the building code to level the playing field, as we call it, between creating a second unit in a new home and an existing home. The standards are somewhat different, and the idea was to try to standardize them at some level in order to reduce the cost of constructing a second unit in a new home. And there was some consultation this fall in terms of the first round of consultation on the next update of the building code, where some of our colleagues were exploring those potential changes. And those are being considered now. And we'll wait and see about those as the next edition of the building code is developed. So I'm going to stop there and turn the webinar over to Arlene Etchen from CMHC.
Great, thanks, Victor, and good afternoon, everyone. I understand some of you are having a hard time hearing. We're going to try to speak up, but if you're not dialed in via the phone line, I suggest that you try the phone line as an alternative to listening via computer. And we've disabled the chat just because we're getting a lot of messages across our slides, so we're just hoping to clear our screen so we can give you a better presentation. So I'm pleased to be part of this second unit's webinar, and I'm going to give you an overview of some of CMHC's research around second units, which we also refer to as secondary suites and accessory apartments because we're a national organization. So Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, is Canada's national housing agency. And over the past few years, CMHC has been focusing its efforts on aging in place, accessibility, and housing sustainability as part of our outreach, because we know there's an increasing need for safe, affordable, and accessible housing. Most recently, CMHC had the opportunity to partner with the Ontario Professional Planners Institute to conduct a survey of the current state of second units across the province of Ontario, to identify strategies and lessons learned that can be shared with local planners to help further facilitate the implementation of secondary suite policies. We worked with SHS Consulting, with Jody Ball as the project lead, to analyze survey results and write the report and case studies. So we had 4 key goals for this project. Because we're working sort of in the aging in place space, we wanted, and secondary suites seemed to come up as sort of a great solution for this. We wanted to assess the status of second unit policy implementation. We wanted to determine whether these policies are part of an affordable housing strategy or a senior strategy. We wanted to identify successful approaches to the implementation of second unit policies, and finally develop case studies that highlight what worked, what didn't work, and how municipalities overcame barriers to implementation. While we have other studies that look at second units, we didn't have anything that looked at them in the context of aging in place. And given that the province had encouraged the implementation of second units, we thought we'd be able to get some good insights as to the challenges and barriers. So here's what we found. So to do this project, we reached out to planners via OPPI and asked for input to a survey which was created in SurveyMonkey and available to planners through a web link and, where possible, sent via email. There were over 143 responses that were completed from municipal planners and staff from single, upper and lower tier municipalities and utilized in the study. Now, so while there were some duplicates in the study where you have multiple planners, we created a master result for each of the communities. So we had 113 responses. And this gave us trends and identified barriers, success factors, and gave us case studies, sort of a snapshot of what's happening. So what we found overall was about 1/3 of the survey respondents said that second units weren't permitted prior to the legislation, but now a majority of those respondents, so 64% of the respondents, had official plan policies in place. Kind of shows the impact of the legislation. And 54% reported that zoning bylaw regulations had been adopted by council. And while the majority of municipalities surveys had plans and policies in place, we noted that many had zoning restrictions, like parking, minimum maximum floor size, and minimum frontage. Several municipalities also reported that second units were only permitted in areas with full municipal services. What we did find sort of anecdotally, and this is probably no surprise to most planners out there, so communities with septic systems often face an additional assessment. Of course, that's being able to develop second units because they have to make sure there's sufficient capacity. When we're interested in learning more about rural second units and how to encourage their development, so anyone who's working in a rural municipality wants to connect with me afterwards, I'd love to hear the stories, because we're finding that seems to be a real concern. And then other concerns included things like student housing, maintaining community character, and with the evolution of things like Airbnb, properties used for vacation rentals. So those were some of the concerns. So moving to second units as part of a seniors or housing strategy, what we found was approximately a quarter of all municipalities that we surveyed said, yes, it's part of their housing and homelessness strategy to have second units, while about 8 or 9% included them as a senior strategy. And there were some municipalities that included them as both. So this is important for us to see how second units were viewed. We're finding that with our outreach to municipalities around aging in place and age-friendly communities, that second units will play an important role with aging in place, whether seniors rent out for more income, a caregiver lives in a second unit, or it becomes a transfer of wealth plan. And I'll describe that a little bit more later. Again, the barriers probably won't be a surprise for most people. The top 6 include parking, safety and building code issues, municipal services, and then legal and liability issues, design and architectural integration, and community opposition. The biggest message we got was that these issues, most of them can be addressed through education and public consultation. So when we asked, how did you overcome some of the barriers? Again, education and raising awareness, either in city halls or communities. People also did community consultations, seeking advice from other planners, seeking advice from organizations like OPPI or CMHC. And we say one municipality reported offering incentives. There's actually a number in Ontario that are starting to do this. So it helps people with that sort of cost piece of it all. A few comments from the planners include things like educate the public and the council on affordable housing and sustainable community planning benefits. Effective communication and collaboration between all municipal departments is essential. And education is not just about the public, but also getting internal buy-in from council and other departments. So as a result of this research, people identified themselves to be profiled in case studies. And so we've developed 5 case studies of municipalities of varying sizes and stages of implementation, from a rural community to large urban centers. And while not all of these have fully completed second unit policies and bylaws, they highlight lessons learned and the challenges and strategies that can help second unit policy succeed. And the case studies are available as part of the full report, which will be available online at the end of this webinar. So a couple highlights from each of them. So in Ottawa, of course, there's the coach houses legislation that we'll go into more. In Welland, we found that it was mostly for older residents, but Niagara that were interested in second units, but Niagara has offered incentives to build. Their advice is to simplify policy and the application process. In Mississauga, of course, a community that's well known for its work in second units, they did a comprehensive community engagement process. And that included educating council, public, a stakeholder forum, and even a design workshop. They have a registration form with no fee for registering. Wasaga Beach has developed a guide for second units, and actually it's quite good because it not only goes into how to develop second units, but it also offers information about how to be a landlord, which is a really important part of this. And of course, they're part of Simcoe, which also has incentives. And in Merrickville-Wolford, there's not a lot of big take-up on second units, and it's mainly for elderly parents. Part of their challenge is they want to maintain their community character. So those were some of the things that we saw. Going back to Ottawa, so they recently changed their bylaws to permit construction of coach houses on many existing residential lots. Apparently this started as a discussion paper in 2015, and then the zoning bylaw was approved by committee and council in December of 2016. Staff have been directed to come back in 2 years with a review of the policy's implementation. So the idea of the coach house is to allow for a gradual and discrete type of intensification, particularly in low density neighborhoods that might have been originally built as nothing but single detached houses. And they have a great guide called How to Plan Your Coach House in Ottawa. And in our travels around, we're finding that this is gaining more interest in different municipalities. Of course, in Toronto, there's a group called Lanescape that's trying to get laneway housing streamlined in Toronto, and laneway housing in a few other places. But I know when we speak with our people around aging in place, they're finding that this is of great interest to them when they're thinking of caring for an elderly parent. We have a case study that we did in Kingston. A planner let us know about this particular developer called Caraco, and they purpose-built second units as part of a subdivision. And I believe that about 40% of the subdivision has second units. So you can see on the picture on the left, there are 2 doors. One goes to the basement, one goes on the main floor, and they're quite lovely spaces. There's kind of a neat story about this. This is an anecdotal story from the builder. who said that there was a grandmother and a grandson that bought one of these places. The grandmother lived on the main floor. The builder made it all accessible for her. The grandson lived in the basement. And their arrangement is when she can no longer live there, the transfer of ownership moves over to him. And it's a way of transferring wealth. So it's a way we'd never really thought about dealing with secondary suites. So just to give you a couple more pieces of our research that might help, last year, again with SHS, we did a literature review and case studies of local jurisdictions that permit second units. It's research to support knowledge and informed decisions. We documented approaches of governments across Canada to allow or encourage the development of secondary suites in residential areas. We wanted to learn how these approaches work to increase the supply of affordable rental housing. So the research goes through the benefits and issues in depth and provides good research backgrounds for second unit policies. I'm just going to take you through just a couple of the quick case studies and highlights. In somewhere like Nanaimo, they had a challenge around illegal suites, and they needed to facilitate more affordable housing. So what they did was, originally, secondary suites was allowed in single residential zones in 2005. In 2011, they revised the policy and permitted it in agricultural and commercial zones as well as accessory dwellings. And as of 2014, the staff reports that secondary suites have become Nanaimo's most common form of new rental housing. Now, a couple things they did on the policy side, they doubled the fees for solid waste collection, but it's resulted in 1,128 permits being issued for new suites between 2006 and 2013. In Edmonton, it was part of their affordable housing plan, where they offered grants. They opened up sort of the access to the ability for people to build second units in a wider range of zones. And they gave a grant program, and this resulted in 1,174 permits. Now, only about half of those use the grant program, but it's just nice to see the uptake. And finally, in St. John's, again, it ended up becoming part of an affordable housing target. Originally, it was just in place to help with affordable rental, but when they made it part of their business plan, it increased the supply of affordable housing, so 783 permits between 2009 and 2014. So obviously I'm giving you a very high level view. There's much more detail in the case studies if you're interested. And one last publication that we have, which is our accessory apartment regulations. This was done last year with Munisco. And we looked at regulations from 498 Canadian municipalities to assess if the regulations enable or disable the creation of accessory apartments. So the focus was only on those units that were created legally through a development or building permit process. So what we did was they looked at the provisions and found out which were likely to hinder, which were unlikely to hinder, and which were case by case. And of the 498 municipalities where second units are permitted, about 42% have enabling bylaws with no restrictions or few conditions. This is across Canada. 10 have somewhat restrictive conditions, and about 46% have restrictive regulations with a combination of conditions. So as I said, all of these publications are available at the end of this webinar. I'm going to turn it back to Victor.
Thank you, Arlene. And just for the audience, it's kind of coincidental that CMHC was doing all this research at the same time that we were promoting a greater take-up of second units through the LPAS update. It was coincidental, but I guess that means it's a timely topic for a lot of people and governments. So, similar to CMHC, our ministry undertook some research with respect to the take-up of second units in terms of revised official plan, policies, and zoning bylaws. And many of you might say that your municipality already had second unit provisions in their official plan and or their bylaw. But our research focused on assessing whether municipalities had updated their official plans or bylaws since the legislative changes took effect back in 2012, January 1st. So it had almost been 4 years, and there was some interest in determining the level of take-up. And recall that Planning Act requires both the official plan and the zoning bylaw to authorize the second units in the three housing types. There was no time frame associated with when that work had to be done, but those of you who may be familiar with the Planning Act will recognize that the 5-year review requirement in the Planning Act for an official plan basically says that municipalities need to update their official plans to reflect any provincially issued policies, plans, requirements like this between their last official plan and when they undertake their review. And so the review is a 5-year cycle, so we were thinking at an upset limit, most municipalities would get to this within 5 years, which we just tripped over on January 1st, 2017. There is also a requirement in the Planning Act that municipalities should update their zoning bylaws within 3 years of an updated or new official plan, and that the zoning bylaw shall conform to the official plan. And so it's a 2-step process in terms of updating your policies and then making sure the bylaws reflect and conform to those policies. Another thing we were interested in was the nature of the policies and zoning provisions. And as you heard Arlene mention through some of their Canadian research, while the official plans were generally permissive, the zoning bylaws sometimes had restrictions or onerous requirements or limitations that would hinder the creation of a second unit. So we were quite interested in doing some qualitative analysis as well. And so what did we find? What we looked at was the number of municipalities that had actually updated their official plans and or bylaws since January 1st, 2012. And of the 444 municipalities in Ontario, a relatively low percentage had actually undertaken that work. In some cases, the municipal official plan and zoning bylaw might be fully compliant, even if it goes back some time. But our experience is that most municipalities that allowed second units historically probably didn't have as permissive a framework as the legislation would now require. And again, in undertaking that assessment, what we found was, while many of the ones we looked at had updated their official plans, some had yet to do their zoning. That's not unusual that you see this bit of a lag, but we know in some cases municipalities were updating their official plans and zoning bylaws as a package to put them before council to give them a holistic understanding of the proposed revisions of those documents. On the qualitative side, we did identify a number of potential limitations to establishing second units, and I'm going to go through those because, again, linking back to CMHC's research, we're looking to see if there are particular provisions or policies that would actually hinder the establishment. And then as a counterweight to that, identify some of the best practices that municipalities are engaged in that are more permissive in nature. So another thing you heard Arlene speak to was a desire from many fields for information to help raise awareness about second units. And so we're in the final stages of publishing an info sheet on our website, not in print. And that should go up shortly, we hope. And that info sheet essentially explains what second units are, why they're important, some of the things I've covered already, their basis in the Planning Act, which we've discussed about, and most, or importantly, some of the current best practices that we've identified from Ontario municipalities. So it's always good to look close to home to see what others are doing. And Arlene mentioned some of the innovative things we've seen, including some grant programs in some of the municipalities. So you've heard me talk about permissive. So the Planning Act requires that municipalities authorize second units in official plans and zoning bylaws. And that's an important piece in terms of the zoning. For the purposes of our info sheet, we use this phrase as of right. And so what we mean by that is that refers to the ability of a property owner to apply for a building permit to create a second unit without having to make any sort of development application like an official plan amendment, or zoning bylaw amendment, a minor variance, or a site plan. And in some municipalities, a zoning bylaw amendment and or a variance or site plan are required. And the idea is that a homeowner should be able to just deal with the building department and fire as well to make sure the second unit meets all requirements in terms of the building code and fire code, and to go directly to the building official at the municipality and obtain a building permit. Most second units would require one. And the idea is that this would avoid other third parties getting involved, including neighbors and other adjoining property owners potentially. Second units are internal to a dwelling or to an accessory structure, and the thinking then is that should be a matter between the homeowner and the municipality. And further to that, the thinking, or building on that, the thinking is that generally, homeowners should not be required to produce some type of study or demonstrate that they conform to a policy or zoning provision, or that they have, for instance, there's sufficient servicing capacity in a fully serviced community. And I'll come back to that. But again, if we're looking to have these as of right, then zoning can't be conditional, and so requiring these types of studies or any other sort of demonstration takes away from the ability to make them as of right. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. So I'm going to go through some of the best practices that we've profiled in our info sheet that you'll see when it hits our website. And I wanted to start with the township of Wainfleet. And this example is to show a municipality that allows second units in the 3 different housing types that we've spoken about and in ancillary structures. So I'm just going to read from it a bit because in addition to the housing type, the first bullet you see shows that Wainfleet is allowing second suites in all residential area designations. So that's often at the official plan stage, which is a good thing and permissive. And then it refers to the bylaw and some criteria, and basically it says secondary unit, only one, because we're only talking about a single second unit, is permitted in single detached, semi-detached, or a townhouse dwelling. So quite permissive. And then following from that, it also says the secondary suite may be contained within a primary dwelling or a building or structure accessory to the primary dwelling, but not in both. And you recall me speaking either it's a one or another situation in relation to the Planning Act. And it would be up to the municipality's discretion together with the homeowner whether they sought to put one in the primary dwelling or in an accessory structure. So here we're moving to official plan designations now. And this is an example from Hay Valley Township official plan. At least the policy is. The actual schedule or map on the is an excerpt from the City of Mississauga official plan. And the blue is employment designations and yellow is essentially living areas. But back to the policy in Hay Valley. It basically says an accessory apartment, secondary suite, is permitted in residential areas within a 4-season single-detached, semi-detached, or row house dwelling unit, or attached to a garage located on a road, maintained year-round and accessible by emergency services, subject to considerations of carrying capacity of lakes and hydrological capacity. So the first thing I wanted to focus on there was they allow it in residential areas, which is essentially all their official plan designations that allow residential. But it has to be a 4-season residential area. So essentially they're not allowing them in recreational or cottage areas. And I'm going to come back to some of the other criteria in a moment. So generally, we're looking to see official plans allow second units in all residential designations. Probably an exception would be if there's a high-density residential designation where there's nothing but multi-residential apartments that would not be an area to look to see allowed. But as we explored the official plans through our research some more, what we identified was that some of the limitations that we were seeing in official plans and bylaws, to a lesser extent, were actually quite reasonable. So I think we could all agree from a safety perspective that putting second units or allowing second units in areas that are prone to flooding is likely not the best idea, particularly basement apartments. So our view is that it would be completely valid to restrict them in flood-prone areas. Similarly, we saw a number of municipalities restrict them in waterfront areas or developments, particularly on private roads that are not maintained year-round necessarily. And in part, this was due to concern about emergency access potentially being limited. So again, from a health and safety perspective, there's some legitimacy to municipalities restricting them in areas like that. And you saw, going back to Hay Valley, that's one of the limitations or criteria that they include in their policy. Following from that, as Hay Valley did, they wanted to take a look at where there was limited lake capacity or hydrological considerations. And again, given the capacity constraints of some surface waters and lakes, a very reasonable thing to consider, particularly because typically development around those lakes is on septics as opposed to municipal services. And then again, back to recreational dwellings, the last bullet, we saw a number of municipalities not allowing second units in some of these recreational areas, in part because of the lack of year-round roads, but as well because of the lack of other needs and services that residents in those units may require on a year-round basis. So here's a series of examples where, professional judgment and local circumstances and other planning objectives relating to health and safety or environment need to be woven into the development of a municipal second unit framework. So we're going to move on to new dwellings. And as you heard me talk about earlier, we've proposed, amended the Development Charges Act and are proposing a regulation and looking at the building code to actually promote second units in both both new and existing dwellings. The rationale being that it's more cost effective and efficient essentially to design a second unit in a brand new structure rather than trying to retrofit it 10 or 20 years down the road, particularly when it comes to fire separation, electrical, HVAC, egress and ingress as well. And Arlene had that nice example from Kingston where the builder is doing just that and marketing those homes from that perspective that they have a pre-designed second unit in it. And I think generally what we're seeing in the real estate side of things is real estate agents wanting to understand second units better, both if they're looking at prospective purchasers who might be looking for a home with one, and or if a homeowner has one, in terms of marketing that in listing of the property. So we'll move on to parking, and you may recall Arlene's slides identified parking as one of the, I think, the largest barrier. And in some of their pan-Canadian work, I think, identified parking as a potential hindrance in some situations. And so we've got three examples here from different municipalities, starting with the city of Ottawa, where they allow a second dwelling in a low-rise development in mature neighborhoods. No parking at all is required for the second unit. And there's a number of other municipalities which have waived parking in certain circumstances, particularly when they're close to transit. In a number of instances, though, we've seen municipalities require more than one, and that can be a hindrance to creating a second unit, particularly if the requirement says that the parking spaces have to be side by side. So even if you only required one, but said it needed to be beside the parking space for the primary dwelling, this would essentially mean that you'd have to have a double car driveway, and would right off the bat preclude any home with a single driveway from having a second unit. So Mississauga and some others allow what is called tandem parking, where you can park, the parking space can be located behind or in front of another space. So a single width driveway would be eligible because the cars would be parked end to end, and one would have to potentially go out and move the cars at some point, but lots of households do that today. And the City of Toronto builds on that by providing a definition in their bylaw about what a tandem parking space is so that people can understand it. So there's some samples of municipalities taking progressive and permissive approaches to help facilitate second units in relation to parking. So servicing is the next topic I wanted to touch on. And generally, our view is that in fully serviced communities with municipal sewer and water, there should be no requirement for a homeowner seeking to establish a second unit to have to demonstrate that there's sufficient sewer or water in the municipal system to accommodate the second unit. You know, the only type of exception we could really think of is potentially if the sewage treatment plant, for instance, was under some sort of order by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change due to lack of performance. However, in privately serviced areas where developments on septics and private wells, it's a different situation, and Arlene alluded to this. In Ontario, plumbing, the septic system is designed on the basis of how many bedrooms and plumbing fixtures one bedroom, if not more, as well as the kitchen and bathroom facility. So it's legitimate that the municipality should be able to require the homeowner to demonstrate that the septic system and or the well are sufficient to accommodate the new development. And here's where it would be difficult to allow second units as of right, because here's a situation where there needs to be some due diligence before a homeowner creates one. So unit size. In Ontario, the building code is the key document for standards relating to building matters, including the size of units or the size of an apartment, second unit apartment, and other standards like that. We've seen in some cases that municipalities have tried to limit the number of bedrooms and or establish size requirements for second units. Our view is that those types of questions or matters should be left entirely to the building code because it was developed specifically for that purpose, and any zoning thus should not conflict with the standards set out in building code. Just a little additional piece of information: the Development Charges Act today states that in order for a second unit in an existing home to be exempt from development charges, it must be smaller than the primary dwelling. And so that's probably a legitimate statement that municipalities want to require that to be transparent to homeowners so that they would be eligible for exemption from the development charge bylaw. If you have one, some municipalities don't. So a couple of other matters, and we're just getting close to the end, is in relation to egress. So again, the building code and the fire code in Ontario established the minimum standards, if you will, for access. There needs to be two. I'm not going to go into the details, but they can be doors, or they can be a door and windows subject to certain size requirements and that sort of thing. So it's important to confer with your building department to understand what those are so you're aware. But again, our view is that zoning bylaws should not attempt to generally regulate egress. It should be left up to the standards in the building code and the fire code. Having said that, a number of municipalities, in particularly more historic neighborhoods, have said they don't want a second front door. We're just having a bit of a technical glitch. One moment, please. So I'll keep speaking. Our screen's gone blank. We don't know what yours is, but so some municipalities may like to feel that a second front door on a house, again, particularly in a more historic neighborhood perhaps, does not meet with their own design objectives and neighborhood objectives. And so in those instances, if you want to require the door to be on the side, then again, that should be set out in the bylaw. And we've seen again in more historic or heritage neighborhoods, some municipalities like to have streetscape and potential architectural design requirements. And again, in order for the second units to be as of right, any such streetscape or architectural requirements should be embedded right in the bylaw, the zoning bylaw, so the homeowner will know what the requirements, limitations are, and can then design the unit accordingly without having to seek some sort of input from the planning department in terms of that. And then Lastly, on this slide, another practice we've seen in some municipalities is to require the owner of the primary dwelling to live in it in order to have a second unit. The Planning Act does not allow for zoning on the basis of relationship, so we don't feel that's an appropriate provision to have in either an official plan or a zoning bylaw. So just getting near the end, a number of municipalities have created registries to be able to track second units. And I think one of the things we're all interested in is trying to make sure second units are created legally. We know there's lots of illegally constructed ones. And part of that is to ensure that they meet building and fire code in particular. And so in Brantford, for instance, they actually have set up a registry and require through their official plan that any second units are registered. This is certainly helpful with emergency services as well in terms of knowing where there may be second units. So just to wrap up almost, based on our research, and our Minister Ballard, the Minister of Housing, in November of this past fall, sent a letter to all heads of council in Ontario, and basically was alerting them of the fact that we had made some changes in LTAS for the building code and development charges, that we'd like to see those municipalities who have not begun updating their plans to move along with that, to alert them that we were going to be releasing some information materials, and I'll get back to that. And then lastly, that he was proposing or instructing staff to post a regulation about second units, which I referred to at the very start. And so that regulation, proposed regulation, was posted yesterday on the Environmental Registry, and it proposes to deal with three of the matters that we identified as limiting second units. And so the first item is to set a maximum of one parking spot per second unit and to allow tandem parking. The second is that there could not be a requirement that the primary unit had to be occupied by the homeowner in order to have a second unit. And thirdly, it would state that a second unit could be constructed regardless of the date of construction. And so some municipalities, for instance, said you can't have a second unit in a new home until 5 years after it was built. And as you heard me say earlier, we're promoting second units in new homes for those reasons, and so we felt this type of restriction was not in keeping with the direction that we were going. And so the info sheet I referred to and should be coming out shortly. And just before we do questions, I've moved to some additional resources. So the Landlord Self-Help Center, which is an organization out of Toronto that assists landlords, has updated a bunch of resource material that they had previously had, and it's been designed to be province-wide. So there's a couple of posters at the top, and then they have 3 guides. One's on financial considerations, one's on creating a second unit, and one's an operating guide if you are a landlord. And so these are geared towards municipalities, landlords, and tenants. And as well, CMHC has a variety of materials that are being spoken. So on that note, we'll see if any questions have come in on the chat line. We're just waiting for a couple of people to type questions. We haven't gone away. Stay tuned. One question we have here is, how are second units treated in the census? I'm looking at Arlene because that's a federal thing. I don't know. Arlene, do you know?
I don't know. I know that there's several projects going on about secondary suites. Actually, at McMaster, they're trying to look at how to identify them. The challenge is, unless they are unless they're legal suites, it's hard to measure them. So I'm going to have to ask our economist that and get back to you. My apologies.
Right, we have another question, and it says, if second suites begin to be used as short-term rentals, less than 30 days, rather than long-term rentals, would the second suite still be meeting their original goal? So I think I'm looking around the room, we're all kind of shaking our heads. The short-term rental, Airbnbs, things like that, are a separate item that certainly aren't in keeping with the original goal of the province in requiring second units. And I think the approaches to these short-term rentals are evolving as we speak, and we're seeing different municipalities turn their minds to it and come up with different approaches to them. So here we have another question. Does the development of second units in new homes count towards a maximum density calculation? So that's a good question, and we've heard that. Generally, our view is that they should not count towards the density calculation, in part because there's no guarantee that a second unit will ever be occupied, and or it could be occupied for a short period of time, let's say, maybe a young family trying to pay the mortgage, and then they have a family and the tenant leaves and the house is occupied solely by the family. So let's see, we've got quite a few questions. Will this presentation be available after this webinar? Yes. Here's another one. How are second units treated in the calculation of residential density on new builds? We have had the argument put forward on newer plans of subdivision that their density should be considered to be doubled because each of their new homes could have a second unit in the future. I'll leave it to what I just answered before, that we don't see that being included in the density calculation for some of the reasons I mentioned.
Post the slides. Oh yeah, so the slides are going to be available through the OPPI YouTube channel. We'll try to get up in the next few working days.
So here's another question. In new construction, houses with secondary units are subject to limiting distance restrictions per the Ontario Building Code that decrease the building footprint. How can we overcome this restriction when designing with houses with secondary units on infilling projects where the lot sizes are limited? I think we're going to have to park that because we're not entirely clear on the scenario that's being identified there. So, do we have any more questions? Thank you. Great webinar. You're welcome. That wasn't a question, it was a comment. So Loretta from OPPI has mentioned that she'll send out an email telling people when the presentation is posted on OPPI's website through social media. I should say in the interim, some more questions are just coming up. Certainly, you're free to call the ministry. You can call our head office or email us. And as well, we have regional offices in Toronto, London, Kingston, Sudbury, and Thunder Bay. And the staff at those regional offices are more than happy to discuss second units with you. We've all been working on this research and the development of our best practices together. We see it's 1 o'clock now, and so we're going to close the webinar, even though there's some additional questions. So I encourage you to follow up with us, and perhaps if there's interest, we'll do more outreach in the months to come. I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the ministry, and I'll turn it over to Arlene.
Great, thank you everyone. I can see there's some questions we haven't answered, so we're going to try to capture them, and maybe what we can do is share them via OPPI with the questions and answers, if that's possible. And I want to thank everyone for attending. We want to thank the Ontario Professional Planners Institute for partnering with us on this. And Victor, you and your colleagues from Municipal Affairs and Housing, our Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and thank you to everyone. Our apologies for those that couldn't get on the line, but we will try to, seeing the interest in this one, we might look at doing another one. And as we said, this will be available through the OPPI YouTube channel. Thanks everyone and have a great day. Oh, I'm going to put polls up if you can just identify where you're from and the result.